Welcome back and happy Wednesday. This week, I want to talk a little bit about grieving what others don't understand. Sometimes I think one of the hardest parts of grief, some grief, isn't always the loss itself. Sometimes it's realizing that no one is ever going to fully understand why it hurts the way it does. Not because they don't care, but because they're standing in a different place. Some losses can only be known from the inside, and they don't translate cleanly, and they resist explanation. And when we try to make our grief understandable to everyone else, we often end up editing it, softening the truth, trimming the edges, or even keeping parts of it quiet. And at some point, that can just put us in a place where we find ourselves waiting for understanding, waiting for agreement, waiting for someone else to say, yeah, this counts. Like, you are allowed to grieve this. But grief doesn't actually need consensus to be real, to be felt. There's something I've come to understand just recently, and that is when permission to grieve comes from within, things can start to loosen. I'm beginning to feel that loosening. And I want to share something carefully because it matters. One of the places I've felt this kind of grief most deeply is around the complicated nature of my marriage. From the outside, there was love, devotion, and a family doing its very best to stay together. And all of that was true. But there were also layers of struggle, loss, and quiet sorrow that didn't have language at the time and didn't feel safe to name. And so for a long time, I felt pressure to protect the story that others held, to protect that perspective, to be careful, to not say too much, and to minimize the parts of my grief that didn't fit the picture that people understood. And I want to be really clear about this. Naming that complexity now isn't a betrayal. It doesn't undo the love. It doesn't negate the effort, the faith, or the goodness that existed. It simply allows me to grieve honestly what I carried and what was lost, even as we were trying our best to hold everything together. And here's the part that matters most for today. I couldn't simply decide to give myself permission and then move on. That permission was, in many ways, offered to me long before my heart was ready to receive it. And through long, hard work, and honestly, the steady presence of a therapist who helps hold space for what I don't yet know how to hold, things are starting to loosen. And looking back, I think she tried to give me that permission really early in our work together, but it took me time to trust it, to believe that it applied to me, and to let it settle deeply enough that I could begin offering it to myself. And even now, that loosening is slow. The work is messy, and it's way more labor intensive than I'd like. There are deeply rooted patterns that had years to grow and tangle themselves inside me. I'm learning that it's less like flipping a switch and more like clearing weeds from an overgrown garden. Progress is happening, but it's taking time, patience, and gentleness with the whole process. But the key thing that I've learned and that I want to share with you is that you don't need permission from others to grieve honestly. Sometimes we do need help, though, in learning how to give ourselves that permission. Grief isn't healed by explanation. It isn't resolved by approval. It can soften when it's allowed to just exist slowly and perfectly and with support. If your grief makes sense to your heart, that's enough. You're allowed to take your time. You're allowed to need help. You're allowed to grieve what others may never fully understand. So here's a question to think about. Where in your life might you still be waiting for permission? And what kind of support might help you begin offering that permission to yourself? Before I close, I just want to say thank you. Thank you again for listening in. Thank you for supporting me in this. Every like, every comment, every time you share this message, these are not small things. They're helping to create a community where grief can be witnessed, not rushed. And it's a reminder that none of us are walking this journey alone. Also, if you find it helpful to listen here, remember there's also a written version in my weekly newsletter. In addition to this message, the newsletter is a way to stay connected with the waiting place. And you can learn where I'll be speaking, find other resources in our community, and find ways to gather. You can access that newsletter to sign up for it on the website. Either way, you're always welcome, just as you are, wherever you are. Have a great week. See you next week.